Hello, everyone. This is Jorge and Jared, and welcome to Econify, your weekly podcast. So, today, or anytime, we're talking about the Irish Famine, also known as the Great Hunger, guys, a mass starvation disease that happens during 1845 to 1852. With me is the scholar, professor, MBA candidate Jared, who's going to take us there. Jared, give us the facts.
Slante. Today we're talking about the Irish Potato Famine, as Jorge mentioned, especially as it relates to a few big themes here: religious, political, and immigration. So join us for a great ride. For one, let me ask you this. What is the best kind of bar from an ethnic perspective?
The Irish bar?
Of course. I don't think there's really even a close second. Everyone knows Irish bars. They know the Celtic culture of Ireland, for how jovial the people are and the impact that they have had to the United States and have had really all across the world. At one time, Irish were viewed as, the lowest people in society. They were ravaged by unemployment in the early parts of the United States. Think in your mind those old posters that said, Irish need not apply. So the Irish have definitely had a struggle throughout their history. And even after leaving their country during such a turbulent time as the Great Hunger, they came to the New World, they faced adversity, and they conquered.
Wow. So they did a Julius Caesar. I came, I saw, I conquered.
Exactly, Jorge. Yeah. Right? So basically, I guess you could ask, why do we think, Ireland? I just had some Irish cheese this morning. This is a country that has so much pasture lands, that has a lot of water, that has a lot of coastland for fishing. What happened here? Why was the Irish society in such tough straits during the Irish famine? And why were they so dependent on potatoes? For that question, you have to look at the English rule of the time. So that through colonization of Ireland, Ireland didn't really have an autonomous rule over its society. So the British were really in charge of the Irish island, if you will. So they implemented their own church, even though most people in Ireland are Catholic. They instituted a Church of Ireland, and even though only 1/7 of Ireland was Protestant. So from a religious perspective, they faced persecution as well. Jorge, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so how did it happen? How the British government got to rule over Ireland? And we understand now there's Northern Ireland and Ireland, and Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, and I guess that's the Protestant part, and the Ireland is mainly Catholic, right? As a consequence of that. But I want to know, how did that happen? How the British people or the British government got to conquer them? Or the English, I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not an expert on this subject, but Northern Ireland is still Ireland, but basically it was due to the religious reasons. It was part of the UK to this day. And you look at even recently the Troubles, which wasn't that long ago. This was the late part of the last century. There are still remnants of colonization and the struggle between Irish independence and the British rule in Ireland for hundreds of years. So one of the main reasons is that the British were a more prosperous society, and mostly Ireland was just agricultural. They had different customs, different rules, and through trade and through global expansion, The British expanded their overseas colonies and empire through trade. They were enriched across the world, trading, even from Asia, really to the New World. So England was, or the UK was enriched, and they had a prerogative to continue to expand, as England is a very dense country. Ireland has a great cattle industry, cheese, a lot of food,
They
grains.
still do.
Of course. It's a very fertile land, mostly in the east. The western part is rocky, so it's not very conducive to farming corn, or doesn't look anything like the American Midwest. But it is good or adequate for potatoes. It's a very rocky land. It's not very easy to cultivate. But one thing, you can see like these ripples across Western Ireland specifically, and that is the way that they can plant potatoes in a place that's so rocky with soil that's not really conducive to farming. Ideally, it should have been used for cattle ranching and the like. That's what the terrain is best suited for. But due to the tenure system in Ireland, the large landlords received taxes that they had to pay to England, and they had tenants on this land. And these tenants were farmers. They would use the land to cultivate potatoes and other crops.
Yeah.
But for the most part, even though they did grow other crops besides potatoes, such as maize, or what they would call back then as Indian corn, Indian as in North American, native, and then also grains of wheat, everything like that, mostly in the east part of the country. But the problem is that was mostly exported, because those are what people call cash crops. And if you would sell the same product in Ireland, you wouldn't get the same. It would be below market rate than you would receive if you sold it on the international market, sold it to England, sold it to the international market in Europe, etc. So, go ahead.
So let's do a recap here. So the British were more successful in trade, therefore they conquered the island of Ireland. They pretty much forced the landlords to pay taxes. I'm guessing those were hefty taxes to the British government. And they also, because of the economics of it, they find it profitable to sold the most, I guess, in viable product in the international market rather than Ireland, because it would make more money for them, which forced the Irish people to cultivate or heavily cultivate, which is the main cause of the famine, because when the potato got infected with a fungus that destroyed the crop, that's where the big hunger happened. Until then, what was the next step? What did the British government did to prevent it, to help them? And how did we get a lot of Irish immigrants into America?
Great question, Jorge. So, for the most part, the British, there was a change in government. They were, at the beginning, before the famine, there was the Tory party was in power. And then the PM Lord John Russell came to power under the Whigs. And the Whigs were a free market, laissez-faire party in England. And that had significant implications to the Irish, because they also didn't like the Irish. So they really weren't concerned with the needs of the Irish, and they continued to allow exports because, mind you, like at the time of the Irish famine, they thought that this was related to the climate, that having an extra wet spring could cause this the potatoes to have a wet rot, is what they called it. But then they realized that across Europe, there was a similar issue with all the potatoes. And actually, the blight, as it's called, the fungus on the potatoes, was originated from Mexico.
Interesting.
And potatoes aren't even native to Ireland. It was brought there in the late 1500s. So it was incredibly, being a Catholic country with many offspring, potatoes was the best way to feed their society. They could export their cash crops and rely primarily on potatoes for their sustenance. But they didn't really have a diversified way of sustenance. They just ate potatoes. So even though they could easily eat grains, they could eat cheese and cattle, this was all going onto the international market because it paid more. But because you had this system of land tenureship, the lords, and I'm not going to blame the lords here, because there are good lords, there are bad lords, and they had to pay taxes to England. So many lords were perfectly, they're good people, and they really cared for their fellow citizens, the tenants on their land. But they were put into a pinch when they weren't getting as much from the land due to this blight, and couldn't really afford, like, they were taxed by the number of people, the number of tenants they had. So in order for them to keep their estate, to keep themselves above water, landlords were often forced to evict these tenants who were sharecropping on the land, growing potatoes for their own sustenance. They were forced to evict those because of the taxes from England, and often their prerogative was to have cattle ranches and have cheese, cattle, wheat, grains that they could export on the international market, but it would all leave the country. It wouldn't go to feed the people because the people didn't have money to pay. Their society was very simple, agricultural, not advanced, so they really overly were reliant on potatoes to simply survive. And even when the times were good, it wasn't like they were enriched like they were in England. They were primarily a sustenance-based agricultural society, so not nearly as advanced as England was at the time. So it's kind of a mixture there, a confluence of, one, what happens if you have a foreign country that tries to erase your culture, and there's kind of this animosity towards foreign occupation. Then there's this element of a caste society where growing products doesn't really represent the needs of the people. It's kind of a gross mix of laissez-faire capitalism, but I don't think that at the end of the day is the problem. I think it is that mixed with this sharecropping caste system in this agricultural society that resulted in exporting products that they could theoretically eat, but the price wasn't right to sell those products domestically. If the UK would buy that, like, if they really cared for the needs of the Irish, they could have bought those products at market rate and returned it back to the Irish through some sort of welfare system. Or, even better, in my opinion, they could have paused taxes for the lords to prevent the evictions so that the tenants would not be forced to leave their lands.
So, based on what you're saying, I'm thinking two things. One, the Irish famine was a product of government failure, right? mainly on the British side. And second, I don't think it's a failure of the market itself, because people people that produce, right, business owners and so on, they are able to adjust to different challenges that come along. But it's the government policy. It is to plant this crop, these potatoes, and the production is infected. Therefore, they're not producing as much as they used to it. They're just becoming dependent on one crop, hence the famine. So they were literally given the option: die or leave, right? And I guess in the ones who choose to leave ended up in America, or they went somewhere else, right? Because the immigration that came from Ireland to America during that time was huge. And that's where we want to take the topic. What first, I want to ask you, how did this problem get resolved? And second, how did America benefit for all these hardworking people that ended up coming here?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're not going to like the answer to this question, but yeah, really, what hit the fan in what was called Black 47. This was a time where, at the beginning, there were these public works projects funded by the government to give people jobs, to build roads, and to kind of rebuild infrastructure, kind of like what we'd see today as stimulus, a stimulus package. But the problem was the inflation of food prices was going up so significantly, and their wages were way too small. So they were getting starvation wages at this point. So the public's work projects were not very effective, and then eventually they ended. But they did have a system where people lived in these workhouses across Ireland, and these workhouses had terrible conditions. So terrible, in fact, that some Irishmen said that it's better to be in prison than in these workhouses. Basically, if you went to one of these workhouses, you would be split. Like, let's say you went with your family, they would split you up, and they would put children in this house. They would put 5 to 15-year-olds in this house, adults in this. So your family was split up, and you were in this very disciplinary, hyper institutionalized environment that
A
was
concentration camp, very
in
much.
essence. And this was funded by the British to kind of discipline them. Basically, all of the policies of the British at this time was just based in this misunderstanding of Irish culture, or maybe not a misunderstanding, but a judgment of the culture. For example, there's this one quote. This is so one of the leaders of the time, Charles Trevelyan. He said, "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the people." Of course, he's talking about the Irish.
What a
So,
douchebag.
so what are you to do? Your best opportunity was immigration, and so about 500,000 Irish went to the UK. The main destination was Liverpool, but because there was also a famine, or not a famine, there was a recession in the UK, in England. There was rampant unemployment, and it's kind of like the struggle with the Irish is not only to have something to eat, but these diseases that were rampant at the time. Dysentery was caused by eating seaweed and shellfish, because the Irish didn't really have anything else to eat, so they were forced to eat from the sea, and it caused dysentery. And there was a range of different fevers, what they called it then: yellow fever, black fever, and also smallpox was just rampant. So when you don't have enough food to eat, you're often your immune system's compromised, and you're more prone to illness. So a lot of people died in that way. So if you're not going to Liverpool or England because the economy is not good there either, the next big place to go is Canada. Canada
Interesting.
is, yeah, it was the cheapest place to go. So if you wanted to, you know, you didn't really want to leave your country, but you wanted food and you wanted to be able to survive.
Hmm.
St. John's in Canada, just on the East Coast, that was a main destination, and they have one of Canada's biggest Irish populations. At the time, it was not Canada yet, but a British colony.
Hmm.
And then also was, of course, the port um, in New York, and that was
Right.
another place. It cost £4 at the time to go to the United States, which was about a 6 month salary for most laborers. But oftentimes, more altruistic landlords would pay for their people, uh, their tenants, to go to the New World, and then they would clear their lands and then set up cattle farming or more cash crops on their lands as their sharecroppers were fewer and fewer. So to answer your question on how it was resolved, that's the answer. So many people left Ireland or died
Yep.
that eventually the equilibrium point meant there was enough food again. But the food came after the exodus. Because there's fewer people, there was now enough food. So that just shows you how much the Irish diaspora left Ireland, and especially places. One of the greatest losses in this is in the western part of the country, with some of the strongest heritage of Celtic tradition, were basically wiped out, and so you lost a lot of that culture and that traditional culture because people were forced to leave in order to survive.
Interesting. And I know they went a lot to Boston, right? That's why they have the Boston Celtics over there, and they have the Irish Pride and so on. I would still celebrate St. Patty's over here, like it's a
Yeah, no, I
national
mean Irish
holiday.
made it absolutely. Yeah, Irish made it all over. They were a huge. They made a huge impact on railroading. They were one of the
Hmm.
major labor forces to build the continental railroad system to the west. And really coming into the New World was it's not like things were better in the New World at this point. Things
Exactly.
were still incredibly difficult. And really, it wasn't until the Civil War where Americans started to see Irish as a necessary force to fight in the war and gained a higher respect for the people as they were fighting in battle. But yeah, it was is definitely a contentious relationship, even going to the United States after surviving that long trying voyage across the Atlantic with rampant, yellow fever, scarlet fever, smallpox spreading. You barely have enough to eat. And really, it kind of depended on if you made it to the boat and you were in good enough condition. Your immune system wasn't compromised enough. There wasn't some outbreak on the boat. You weren't,
Yeah.
there's cases when they were saying like people were sleeping on the same cot next to a dead person, and
Hmm.
their conditions were so bad that people weren't even excited by that or surprised. They were just so used to these dire circumstances and death and despair that this trip to the New World was their only chance. And then once they got to the New World, then they were treated as second class citizens. But that was all a part of the Irish journey to a better life. And you can see like the Irish are some of the most successful people in the United States and one of the most successful immigrant stories in the United States because their religious persecution didn't end under the rule of England. It still existed in the New World, where most Americans were Protestant at the time, and they saw Irish as Catholic drunkards who didn't like to work. It was one of those double entendre things where it's like, oh, the Irish are going to steal our jobs, but they're also too lazy to work. It's like one of those logical fallacies, but they were scapegoated at the time. But that was all a part of, one of the most notable examples is the Daly family in Chicago, where Jorge and I met. We met at Daly restaurant. And
quite funny story.
It is. But the Dalys were a massively impactful Irish family in Chicago that created the Chicago machine. And part of that is because the Irish stick together and they have strong camaraderie, very similar, you see, to other marginalized communities today. There's a strong sense of brotherhood and connection to other people, which is why you still see strong Irish pride, Irish flags, in Irish bars, and a strong connection to that culture, because it's strengthened and fortified through that adversity, through the Irish struggle from the Great Hunger, and also through religious, political, and just overall persecution of the people.
Right. So we're gonna jump into the conclusion, and I agree with everything what you said, Jared. Actually, it was quite amazing and informative. If you look to their Ireland, Dublin, the capital, and so on, they're doing so much better than the British counterparts, and actually, it's a proof of the strength and the will to keep going, adapt to changes, adapt to the market, and actually innovate. I think a lot of companies are basing there. They have a huge, strong education system as well, and they're, in my opinion, they're way better than the English people in terms of markets, business, openness. Um, friend, in my experience, they're also very friendly, and they they experienced a lot of persecution because simply they were Catholic. You know, um, sometimes you have to stick to what you believe. That's part of your value. I remember that your morals and what you bring also brings value to society. And I think that's something that we need to take away from this little podcast about the Irish famine, the causes, the resolution, and the future of the Irish people.
Absolutely, Jorge. I just wanted to add something to that. So the today, actually, after the Irish famine, the Church of Ireland, which was actually a Protestant organist like church that was set up by England, was driven out after the resolution of the famine, and now Ireland's as Catholic as it was ever. Their clergyship increased from lows of 1 to 100,000 of their population, where they would hold mass on the beach next to these ragged cliffs, far away from where any English lord could hear them, and they would have their masses in secrecy because it wasn't allowed in their society. And that increased because the people were fortified after the struggle, and it increased, the clergyship increased 1 to 4,000 citizens. So it increased, by magnitudes. The Quakers also, a Protestant organization, the Friends, the Quakers, they're called the Friends.
Yeah.
They helped, they were the main group who helped the Irish during the famine. But there was also some animosity from the Irish perspective, because the English would try to buy converts by offering food. Not necessarily the Quakers, but this was a strategy of some Protestants to offer food for conversion. And that was seen by the Irish as a very disgraceful thing to do. Today, Ireland is as Catholic as ever. It is a country that is very prosperous, being in the European Union. unlike the UK after Brexit. So many companies see it's very lucrative and a very good idea for them to have their headquarters or have some kind of office in Dublin or somewhere else in Ireland, as it's between the United States and Europe, but it's still under the EU. And also, Ireland has incredibly low corporate tax rates, or at least they did in the past, versus other countries. So it would be very lucrative. I think Apple and many large
Yep.
companies are based in Ireland. Nowadays, even though that has equalized a bit, corporate tax rates aren't as like the difference between Ireland and other countries isn't so vast as it used to be. I think U.S. decreased their corporate tax rates, but companies still stay, partly because of that geopolitical move of being in a great strategic position in the EU and between the continents, and also because it's a great place to do business. So Ireland really fixed itself up and is now an example of, not only just fun times, St. Patty's Day, Guinness, leprechauns. It's of prosperity, partly related to their green and promising flag, their beautiful flag. The luck of the Irish really is something to behold.
On that note, this was Jorge and Jared. Thank you for coming to listen to the Conify. See you guys next week.